So thank you very much for being here. My name is Nils Linden. I will be your moderator for today's talk about information security held by Bozhidar Bozhanov. As you probably know, this talk will be streamed and also recorded. So when you participate by audio or by video, you can be recorded. If you don't want that, don't share your screen or your audio. There will be also a Slack channel. We are currently in track 4. So when you want to discuss later or during the talk, you can discuss there. If you have questions, it would be nice when you ask the question via the Q&A tool. We will have a Q&A session in the end of the talk. But of course, you can also already ask the question during the talk so that we can collect them and answer them in the end in the best order possible. So with that, I want to switch to Bozhidar, who is our talker today. He is the CEO and co-founder of LogSentinel. LogSentinel is a company which offers products to keep sensitive data safe at scale. So they use state-of-the-art storing, monitoring, and analyzing tools for business-related events. He has also 10 years experience in the software industry, so he's knowing what he's talking about. He is, apart from being, of course, engaged in his company, also engaged in other fields. He's a top-ranked user in Stack Overflow. He has a tech blog, which is one of the top Java developer blogs. He's holding talks at different conferences, so we are very happy to have him here. And I think it's super interesting to hear from him about information security, or in more detail about best information security practices and why they might not have been best enough in the past. So with that, the stage is yours, Bozhidar. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my slides.
Which is working, perfect.
Great. So hello to everyone, and thank you for tuning in, if that's the right expression to use for online conferences. I will be speaking about information security from the technical point of view. It has some other points of view as well, but I'll focus obviously on the technical one. As I was introduced, I'm a senior engineer and architect with probably now more than 10 years of experience. I've been saying that for the past 3 or 4 years, so things are growing. Currently, I'm founder and CEO of LogSentinel, which is an information security company. One probably important aspect of my biography is that a few years ago, I was advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister of Bulgaria on e-government, cybersecurity, and all related stuff. Everything else was already mentioned. Now, what is information security and what is cybersecurity? I won't be nitpicking on the terminology here, just a nice Venn diagram that I like showing, that we have information security, which is about information, but we also have cybersecurity, which is about other things that you could get wrong and get damaged through cyber means, through ICT means. So when we speak about information security, it is about protecting stuff. And when things are not protected, it's usually because something has went wrong. So where can things go wrong? Well, unfortunately, everywhere. They can go wrong in the front end, in the back end, in the infrastructure, most importantly, in the human aspect of technology and managing it. So before going into details about all of these different ways things can go wrong, let's first see what would be the purpose of attacks. And why I'm speaking about attacks, because this is usually what happens when something's wrong with information security. It's not just a broken system staying idle and thus incurring damage. Someone has to purposefully do something. And the usual thing that we practically read on the news every day, this is data breaches. There are obviously different types of data breaches. The most interesting to hackers is breaching payment information. So that's credit card numbers, because of the history of how credit cards were used to pay things online. They don't have very strong authentication. So having just the card number is sufficient for an attacker to buy stuff on your behalf. There's also breaches of personal data, and there have been some massive ones recently. Also, messages, emails could also be breached, for example, for political purposes or otherwise. Other purposes of the attack are just causing disruption. They don't want to breach anything, but they want to damage your reputation. They want to stop some time-sensitive services like promotional sales, some, again, election time hacks, or there could be some hackers that just want to watch the world burn. They don't have any motive, they don't want to destroy your reputation, they just want to do the things that they do. And there are obviously attempts to hack banks, there are extortions, there are personal motives, trying to hack your Access account, for example. And on the other end of that spectrum, there's the state-level espionage, where state-level actors, usually Russia, China, Iran, but not just those, engage in cyber activities. So how can things go wrong in the front end? Obviously, I'm not going to give you a full list of front-end vulnerabilities. There is OWASP for that. But let's start with the most simple one. It's XSS, cross-site scripting. It allows an attacker to insert JavaScript in people's browsers. So you are a website, so you own a website, and an attacker wants to attack your customers, your visitors. So he exploits an XSS, and then he's able to inject some JavaScript, which can do practically everything on your customer's browser. For example, collecting their credit card details when they enter it. This is pretty simple, fortunately, to avoid. Just escape all of the outputs and do some filtering on the input, but it's important to filter the output, to escape it, so that no JavaScript is actually printed in raw JavaScript form. There's the man-in-the-middle attacks, which are not obviously just for the front end, but I'm going to give an example with that. Attackers can intercept traffic to and from a server, and this can allow them to replace stuff on the page. Again, leaking credentials or leaking credit card information or anything else. The prevention, again, is kind of easy at first, but we'll see that there are edge cases. You should force HTTPS, always use HTTPS for anything. There's no excuse not to. But also, more importantly, use up-to-date cipher suites. So just enabling HTTPS is not enough. You have to not allow SSL 3.0, for example, to be running, because it's as good as nothing. There's also the cross-site request forgery, where it allows an attacker to perform requests on behalf of the user. Prevention there is using one-time tokens or to check the origin header. I will obviously, all of these are explained in much more detail in OWASP, so I'd recommend you going there after the talk, if you haven't already know them by heart, obviously, to check what exactly is happening in these scenarios and what these prevention mechanisms mean. I like giving examples because that's the way people relate to these otherwise abstract vulnerabilities better. So we have British Airways. It was now a few years ago. Some attacker managed to compromise a static resource server. It was not the main server or servers where the British Airways booking and reservations application was running, but it was some static resource website that they reused for their JavaScript, for example. And the modernizer JS, which is a kind of a standard thing, was modified. Nobody noticed that. However, that script is included in every page. That meant that everyone that visited British Airways website got their credit card details and their other personal details leaked to the attacker because of that. A variation of that technique is used very often to target e-commerce sites for scraping the credit card details. So preventing that is not that easy. You should limit third-party sources. You should check the checksums of your scripts that you include. There is a built-in functionality in the browsers as well as the HTML standard. It's called the server-side integrity. It's a bit tricky to get it working, but you should obviously do something about that, because you can't really rely on the scripts that you include from other sources, including even the same server, that they will be the ones that you expect. Usually Modernizer, jQuery, everything can get a few lines appended to it, and then it's as if you're not in control of what happens to your customers. There's a very interesting example of the Cypher Suite thing that I explicitly mentioned on last slide. New South Wales is one of the states in Australia, and it did an e-voting. I think the particular one was a pilot. So everything was properly secured. There was the proper cryptography surrounding the voting, so nobody could actually tamper with the votes once they're collected. There's pretty good research in that topic. However, the website that you use to log into the system to cast your actual vote was using an analytics software. In this case, it was Piwik, which was hosted on another machine. And unfortunately, that machine allowed for a TLS downgrade attack. It had not the latest Cypher suites, which practically rendered the whole e-voting experiment useless, because you could do a man-in-the-middle attack, downgrading that particular resource, and then include whatever you want, and then draw over the screen with JavaScript, for example, reorder the ballots on the screen, etc. So even such a small thing like a third-party resource from a server that allows a TLS downgrade attack can practically ruin everything. Again, limiting third-party sources is very important. And the final example is one popular Android application, which used to expose the whole file system of the application via HTTP. So anyone that was in the same network, for example, with the device, could browse your files, which isn't a good idea. And in general, do not expose unauthenticated endpoints. The best practices in this field, first and foremost, the OWASP checklist. XSS protection, always force HTTPS, do take care of CSRF, escape everything, output, and try to filter the input. Don't store any credentials on the client side, minimize the external static resources and regularly check them for modifications, disable framing, it's a very risky thing, and regularly update your dependencies because vulnerabilities get found regularly. And if that happens, make sure you're notified that your dependencies have some vulnerabilities detected. Now, the backend vulnerabilities, they're also pretty interesting and important. So the worst thing that can happen is a remote code execution. This means that an attacker can run arbitrary code on your server, and that is practically game over. They own you. So to prevent that, it's not trivial. You have to do many things. One of the things is to regularly update your dependencies. There, for example, in the Java world, in the last few years, Jackson is a pretty standard, popular JSON serialization utility. Unfortunately, there was a vulnerability there, and it tried to pop up in several versions. So you could not really be sure that your JSON serialization of user input doesn't allow an attacker to run whatever they want on your machine. The most trivial one is to never run whatever the user has uploaded. It sounds trivial. We'll see in a bit that it's not something as obvious as we think. SQL injections, they are the kind of the first thing that anyone writing something that uses SQL underneath should learn about. It gives full access to the attacker, in theory, to your database. So you allow them to write arbitrary queries based on in your input fields, for example, the login screen. Prevention is fortunately easy. You do prepared statements. Every language and framework practically now supports prepared statements. So whenever using user input in queries, always go for prepared statement. And the last thing that I will mention, obviously not the last vulnerability option, is weak authentication. So bad password storage, non-secure session cookies, anything related to the authentication. Authentication is hard, that's true. But it would allow attackers to impersonate users, either by guessing their password or brute forcing their password, or leaking a database somewhere else and then using the same password to log into your system, where in which case you have very little things that you can do. So how to prevent these types of attacks? Well, first review your authentication security regularly. And this will be a recurring theme, so you have to review things regularly because things change. Use at least bcrypt. It has built-in salt for storing passwords. I was just researching some solutions here and noticed that one popular tool uses still by default MD5, which is no-go. You should prevent any brute force attempts at least through your web interface or your APIs. That means rate limiting all these calls and blocking it after 3 or 5 attempts, or adding a captcha, something like that. Because if you allow someone to impersonate your users, they can then hack your users because of you. Some examples. There's a few years ago, there was a viral blog post about a remote code execution attack. Someone could just upload a PHP file as an image and invoke it via its URL. I know that sounds almost retarded, but it does happen in the real world, unfortunately. So prevention here, at least in this particular case, is easy. Just do not place stuff and allow users to execute it. In some cases, it's easier because, for example, in Java, you can't just run a Java file. You have to go through compilation, but scripting languages like PHP, they allow you to just run them by URL. So you have to take care of that and check what the client uploads, limit it, and do not actually execute it. If, for example, if it's under images, then just spit it out rather than running it as a PHP. That might be server configuration, it might be upload component configuration, but do take care of that. One personal example, and I'll top it with the most recent one. When I was advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister in Bulgaria, there was an investigative journalist that discovered the SQL injection in one of the websites. It was an old, unsupported website that collected some personal data about civil servants. It was kind of a limited scope, but it still had the personal data of several hundred people, even thousands. What turned out that the company that developed it didn't know about SQL injection. And mind you, that's Council of Ministers of a country. So it's not that rare to encounter SQL injections. So unfortunately, the company has already gone out of business, so there was no one to fix it. And then I went down to the basement and patched the vulnerability literally by escaping queries, because it was using such an old version of PHP in MySQL that prepared statement was too much work, and we just had to sanitize the input. Unfortunately, such a thing happened last year. Again, in Bulgaria, the National Revenue Agency had a SQL injection that led to leaking, I think, data about every citizen in Bulgaria, some data at least about their taxes, not exactly, but related to that. Again, very simple SQL injection found by just running SQL map, just a standard utility for finding these vulnerabilities, and then that gives you control over everything. Pretty unfortunate. Luckily, pretty easy to get around by just using prepared data. The Marriott data breach is another very interesting example. Attackers got millions of passports and visitor location history. Marriott is a big hotel chain. If they didn't go out of business because of data breach, they didn't. Probably because of the virus, they're hit pretty hard. but there was all of this sensitive data unencrypted lying in a database. Now, in some cases, just having data in the database is not good enough. You have to do something extra to protect that information, because this passport data and practically you know who exactly was where exactly. And the most likely version for that attack was probably state-level attack, either Chinese hackers or some of the other countries, where they matched that to the leaked data from the Office of Personnel Management in the United States, which meant that they knew practically everyone that had got some clearance from the Office of Personnel Management and their location in the past several years because of this breach, which was kind of huge. So you have to, in some cases, encrypt the data not just in transit and not just at rest, but probably individually, probably with separate keys, probably manage the keys properly. And IPS stands here and there. It's a system that allows you to track and prevent such breaches. I'll just mention it here. Now, best practice, I already went through most of them. Use prepared statements always, well, not always, but any time that there's user input, and preferably always. Force HTTPS, again, validate user input on all layers, not just in the JavaScript, not just in your controller layer. If you use microservices, validate it on every time it enters another subsystem. Because if someone compromises the previous one that did the validation, now you already receiving unvalidated data. You should regularly review and assess the protocols that you use, upgrade them to newer versions. For example, JWT is something that's been very popular recently. JWT has one very easy way to shoot yourself in the foot by allowing any attacker to pose as anyone, because it allows an attacker to specify a header that lets your server ignore the signature, for example. And this has been a vulnerability for a while, and even the latest versions of some libraries have not patched that. So do check everything properly. Check dependencies for vulnerabilities. This is true for the front end and for the back end. Fortunately, at least in Java, but also elsewhere, you have tools like Maven that let you, via plugins, check against vulnerability databases, whether one of your dependencies is vulnerable. Encrypt as much as possible, at least in data in transit. Data at rest should also probably be encrypted. And in some cases where there's sensitive data like medical data, passports, location data, probably you can try thinking of some per record encryption with separate keys that are ultimately ending up in an HSM. And don't invent crypto stuff. Do not ever try to invent any cryptographic scheme like encryption or hashing or whatever. These things are hard. Trained cryptographers and mathematicians do them for a living, and they get reviewed and re-reviewed until they're approved. So nothing that you create for a week is going to be good enough, so just don't do it. You should log cleverly, meaning you should be able to not log, for example, personal data or credit card numbers, because that's a very usual thing to happen. It's something that sounds obvious when I say it. Well, obviously we don't log credit card details in our application logs, but every now and then, every payment company happens to see that, okay, there were credit card numbers in our logs. There were passwords in our logs, as in the case with Facebook, because someone somewhere just added a debug statement and forgot about it. It passed through review and ended up in production. So we have to take care of that and review our logs regularly to see if there's anything like that, maybe with some automated checks, and keep an audit trail. The audit trail, I will explicitly mention it, not only because my company does that, we do a very secure way to do audit trail, but also because it's a way to make sure what happened in a system. who did what, and that way we'll be able to at least trace, in case of an incident happening, to trace what happened. Because otherwise, if you don't have the audit trail and you don't protect it well, then an attacker just goes, does stuff, covers their tracks and goes away. You even don't know that something bad happened, which is bad by itself. And obviously there are millions of more best practices. So let's now switch to the infrastructure vulnerabilities. Again, tons of them, credential leaks. It's very risky if the credentials of a privileged user are leaked, because that is practically equal to an insider attack. So if your sysadmin's username and password and their certificate, so private key, for example, leaks, then anyone from the outside can pose as an administrator, with some conditions apply, obviously, but they can give you they can give the attacker full access to important part of the infrastructure, including DNS. And DNS is a pretty hard thing to lose control over. Prevention, use multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication should be used not only for your email and for your, application access, but also for your server access. So, for example, in our infrastructure, you cannot log into any machine without doing two-factor authentication with SSH. So we SSH using two-factor authentication. Intrusion prevention, again, intrusion prevention, intrusion detection systems, they're generally umbrella terms for anything that watches over the network logs and the network flow and tries to figure out that something out of the ordinary is happening. They are not bulletproof solutions, but you probably should have something in your infrastructure to watch over the standard pattern of things, because if, for example, someone tries to leak data in mass and bulk, then that will probably catch it. Probably not. You can even go to whitelisting a source IP. So if you don't want, so you usually have an office or several offices, and your system administrators should only be allowed to log in from there. Even if they have some VPN, they should first use the VPN from their home computer, log into the network, and then go from there. So absolutely whitelist the office or the office network, to put it more precisely, for access to critical things like the infrastructure, like DNS, stuff like that. It won't solve all problems, but at least it won't allow attackers from randomly anywhere to SSH to your production. And again, audit trail. It's important to know what happened. Misconfiguration is a very general issue. Older security suites, I already gave an example about that. Unauthenticated access to anything, to S3 buckets, to APIs. Unfortunately, defaults in many cases are unauthenticated. So adding an authentication layer is an extra step. But you should always have in mind that you should add that step not only in production, but even in test environments. For example, I think the Equifax data breach was because of an improperly configured S3 buckets for either public access or semi-public access, so that anyone could just go and get the data of millions of people, because someone didn't properly tick the configuration boxes of an S3 bucket. And a misconfiguration could allow for anything to happen, for direct access, downgrade attacks, everything else that we spoke about. If something is misconfigured, even if a particular piece of software generally allows for prevention of such things, obviously misconfiguring it breaks that promise. Prevention, regular reviews, go and check and validate your assumptions, list all your S3 buckets if we have to start with that, and see if any of them allows public access, and also do regular penetration tests. Fortunately, some regulations and standards require this regularity of penetration tests, but you should have someone external try to challenge your assumptions about your configuration. Unpatched software is, again, a very big issue because things go out of date, things have vulnerabilities found in them. The risk of 0 days affecting you is much higher if you're not up to date. Fortunately, or at least it sounds like that, regular updates and CV, that is the vulnerability database notifications, can solve that. Sometimes regular upgrades are not that easy. You have to schedule them. You have to get something down in some cases. Thank you, Windows. And yeah, but have in mind that unpatched software is indeed a very big problem. And I think in the case of another popular breach recently, I don't remember which one was it. It was a Samba vulnerability in the Windows Samba implementation, which again could have been patched but wasn't. So some examples. Heartbleed, we all remember that, hopefully. It was a 0 day vulnerability in OpenSSL. Practically, well, at least in theory, all HTTPS guarantees were off, any connection was exposed, anything that goes over HTTPS could not be considered secure. Now that's probably an overstatement because it wasn't as trivial to abuse Heartbleed, but you should have assumed that. Prevention, not much you can do about 0 days, but you could just patch things as soon as they were fixed. That was very important. And I was actually fortunate to work on a project back then that for some reason decided to do some message level encryption. So another layer of encryption on top of TLS. And so when Heartbleed hit, we were, well, good that we spent a few months, well, that's an exaggeration, but a few weeks on developing our own encryption layer on top of TLS, because now we don't care about Heartbleed. But yeah, that's in some sensitive scenarios, you should have an additional layer of encryption just in case something like TLS breaks. DNS, I mentioned it already. DNS management credentials are something that should be protected really well, because no matter how secure your infrastructure is, if an attacker gains access to your domain management, then nothing else is good enough. There was a case in Brazil where a bank got their DNS management system hijacked, and so an attacker switched all of their domains to attacker-owned servers, which looked exactly like the ones with the bank. It just harvested credentials and credit card numbers and whatnot. So that was great. Obviously, prevention, do two-factor authentication for all infrastructure parts, including DNS. After I read about that hack, I realized that, for example, my personal websites, the DNS management is not protected. So I went there and asked for enabling two-factor authentication. But in many cases, people forget that. And it's a very interesting single point of failure. If they hack your DNS, then do. And another somewhat personal story, I accidentally, by just being a regular user, found a misconfigured web server for one reservation platform, let's say, and check-in platform. And it turned out that the server is misconfigured, and I can see all of the static files placed on that server. Static files are usually boring, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, some pictures, whatever. But unfortunately, it had also the access logs accessible there. And to add insult to injury, they used get instead of post for posting sensitive data. So practically, you could read all of the submitted forms in that system by just accessing their log files. Fortunately, they patched it. They closed the public directory listing that was enabled there. But it was a very good example of how a very small configuration, directory listing of static files, combined with the fact that you're keeping your log files there, combined with the fact that you're using get instead of post for sensitive data, meant that all of your users are exposed. Some best practices here as well. Multi-factor authentication, already mentioned it, use it everywhere. Network security rules and monitor the traffic. So this is more of a network administrator thing, but it's very important that not everything is open and not everything is exposed. And things are limited to just the ports and the source and destination that are required. Keep software up to date, obviously. Perform penetration tests, protect the server logs. They can contain some sensitive information. Encrypt your secrets in configuration files, because if your configuration files are text files, then someone with access there can just leak them. Now, that doesn't mean that this is a bulletproof solution, but use something, for example, like HashiCorp Vault, which wraps those secrets and lets you access them by API. Privileged access management systems are something to also look at regarding secret management. Don't store production credentials in code repositories. Again, an obvious one, but if you look in GitHub, you'll see that people have their passwords, admin passwords for their sites stored in their GitHub repositories, which is sad. Disable auth cipher suites and use CM or any other solution for monitoring and preventing anomalous behaviors. The human factor is probably the hardest one to fix, because all of the other things, you have a list of best practices. It's a long list, but things that you can still apply. Whereas the human is vulnerable in in a limited probably number of ways. There's spear phishing vulnerability, so-called, where you can target fake emails to someone and use it to practically impersonate them after that, because if they download some malicious thing or you harvest their credentials, you can impersonate them in many cases. Multi-factor authentication, again, is a requirement here, but usually not enough. The audit trail would at least hint you into what happened. It's so widely used technique that I'm not sure why it's still happening, but it is, because people are not familiar with how to prevent it. And it can happen even to the best ones. Even seasoned, trained IT people can fall for a very well-crafted spear phishing attack, unfortunately. There's the general social engineering approaches, like revealing details that can be used to extract passwords, security questions, likely passwords, all of these things that an attacker with sufficient information can use to guess your password. And I recently watched Mr. Robot, which is a very good and very accurate series about hacking and cybersecurity, among other things. And they show how easy you can really hack anyone with social engineering techniques and phishing and whatnot. And it's something that we should indeed do something about, and we'll see what in a bit. And it's a lack of training. People, as I said, people, even technical people, and not to mention non-technical people, are not 100% vigilant all the time. So you should tell them, you should train them, you should do regular drills, regular fake emails to just see how they behave. Obviously, the email solutions should take care of that as well. They should be able to prevent at least some of these spear phishing attacks and phishing attacks in general. They don't do that well at the moment. Hopefully, there will be some technical improvements then. Very quickly through some examples here. The DNC hack, the one that may or may not have led to changing of the election result in the US, but anyway, it was something that there are people prosecuted for, and it was a spear phishing attack. Someone pretending to be Google sent an email, someone opened an email on Hillary Clinton's campaign, and then they could extract all of their emails. Done. It's that simple, unfortunately. RSA secure ID and Yahoo breach, again, spear phishing some privileged or semi-privileged employees, downloading Excel files, using exploits on Flash or some active content on the Excel sheets, and then you lose. So unfortunately, every other attack can also go through a social engineering channel, and people have to be trained a lot. Now, as in most movies, they say it's some general gibberish about technical things that sound complex, and this is how they show hacking. Now, what happens in real life in many cases is, hey, this is Robert Hackerman, I'm the county password inspector. And they just collect someone's password because they ask for it. It's not probably that trivial in some cases, but close to that. What are the best practices here? Other best practices. So from if you can protect your infrastructure and add all of these layers of security, then it's less likely for a human vulnerability to affect you that much. But you should also go for regular training. You should do background checks for very sensitive systems, have audit trail, have multi-factor authentication, mobile security endpoint policies in general, regular social engineering drills, scan your emails, automatic phishing detection. Probably that should be provided by the email software that you use. If not, get an add-on for that. Limiting privileged access to just the systems that are required for that person, etc., etc. Now, is that it? Obviously not. Obviously, I can't give you the whole security knowledge in a 40 or 45-minute talk. And the fact that you're certified is good. Probably you are, but that's just the beginning. It gives you the guidelines, but not the implementation, and audits often miss many things. What you should have, and probably that sounds easier said than done, is having a security mindset. At least key people in the organization should ask themselves what can go wrong at every given moment. Because as we saw already, many things can go wrong, and if you don't ask that question, that doesn't mean it won't go wrong. You should stay up to date, both in terms of your infrastructure and your dependencies and your packages, but also in terms of information. You should know what the current security landscape is. You should strive for simplicity of your infrastructure and your systems, because simple systems are more secure. Any complexity that you introduce, any integration with legacy systems that sometimes is necessary, of course, but this strive for simplicity can reduce the complexity of the systems and then increase the security. And most importantly, don't assume someone else is taking care of that. Don't assume that when you're, for example, an application developer, that the application can be insecure, but the system administrator guys or the DevOps guys will take care of that by just closing a few ports. No, closing a few ports won't fix an SQL injection, for example. So don't assume that it's anyone else's responsibility. It's yours and everyone else's as well. Can tools solve the problems? Probably they can help tools solve parts of the problem, but they introduce some other problems, like having to know them. Like having to know the tools is an additional step. Tools may introduce more complexity, which can reduce security as well. But do look for the best tools and do make the best use of them. They are there to help you, but do not be over-reliant on them. Do not assume that, okay, I have this firewall and I have this intrusion prevention system, so yeah, I'm just going home and everything is taken care of. No, it isn't. Do have a plan. Your disaster recovery plan shouldn't be running around for helps. Disasters do happen. And so have a backup, have a way to restore things, have a way to investigate who did it, know what to do at the moment that the problem hits. Because bad things do happen and we should be prepared to react. What I've been saying so far is don't do this, don't do that, don't allow this protocol, don't allow that cipher suite, don't open this port, don't forget this big list of security important checklists, don't assume that you're secure, don't be complacent. And in the title of the talk, I promised to say why, even though there are so many big lists of things that we should be doing, and it should not be doing, it's still not working. We still see all of these hacks that I gave as examples. So why? Well, too many things to take into account. There's this complex mix of technical and organizational measures that I am not able to cover in probably 3 times this talk, but just too many things. And the problem is the attacker needs just one, and they're in. Things are changing constantly. There's legacy software. It's just a very complex mix of things. It's not taken seriously by organizations. This won't happen to us is a mentality that's very popular. And InfoSec is usually not something that business in many cases care about. Upper management doesn't realize the levels of risk, so they assume, well, what would happen if they hack us? Well, you can be completely destroyed, or nothing can happen. That's also a possibility, but you should realize that risk, and it's often not realized properly. It's barely regulated. Our industry is relying on self-regulation, on standards, on implementing standards, on self-assessment, on stuff like that. Recent attempts are vague or limited, like GDPR, the NIS directive, and prevention is not something that, again, is properly regulated. So there are many factors that play into the fact that we are not yet secure. So is it getting better because of the knowledge that we have and the regulations that we have? I wish that I could say yes. I'm not sure. But who can make it better? Who can make it more secure? Who can make all of these things not go away, but at least get fixed properly in the systems that we use and build? Where we can, as engineers, as whether we are developers, DevOps, or even managers, we can strive to know what can be broken and try to fix it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are left with having 8 minutes of Q&A, because then we have to close the session. So we currently already have one question by Thomas. He asked you what you think about cloud virtualizations, because he says they should give us an extra layer of vulnerability. And what do you think, for example, of assessment tools like Prowler for AWS?
Well, yeah, good question. I mean, the cloud in general is a double-edged sword. It adds some vulnerabilities, yes, because it's someone else's infrastructure, someone else's has to take care of those vulnerabilities. And if you can afford to do all of that on premise, that's probably the more secure way. But in many cases, if you don't have enough people, and you don't have enough budget, and you don't have enough mindset about security, AWS, for example, and scanning tools there are some important, I wouldn't say bare minimum, they're pretty good actually, but they can solve many problems that you would have on premise as well. I'm okay mostly with cloud virtualization, with the cloud in general. You have to take care of some things. For example, do not assume that, as I said, do not assume that AWS is secure. What we, for example, did in a previous company, we stored all of our data there, but we used Lux encryption of our drives, and the keys were stored on premise, in an on-premise infrastructure. So things like that can improve security there. Obviously, it's a very long topic otherwise.
Yeah, that's true. We have another question, which is probably out of the current situation that we're using Zoom. So Zoom was in the media for its security issues or some topics, and some people are asking, what do you think about Zoom security?
Yeah, well, I think they got a little bit more bad press than deserved. Some assume that it's a marketing campaign against them. It did have some security vulnerabilities. The one that I think got most popular was that it resolved links to local and network drives where some vulnerability could be abused. The good thing is that they're working on it, and they realized the fact that if they are going to become a leader, and they already were, but with the virus, things exploded. So I think yesterday they acquired Keybase, so they practically are actively looking to hire more security and cryptographically and privacy oriented people to fix any issues that they have. So even if now things might not be perfect, I think they will get pretty well in a few months time.
Okay. And more general questions, what do you think about the current security situation compared to what it was 10 years ago?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. The thing is, 10 years ago, maybe it looked better, but 10 years ago, we had much fewer systems and much less people were involved, and there were fewer users around the world and fewer devices and whatnot. So with the increased attack surface, and it's increased a lot, maybe the threat hasn't increased as much, but I'm just talking about feeling now. Numbers might disprove me, but we have to take into account that as well. I mean, obviously there are bigger data breaches now, and they're more often, but that may be because we just have more interest. Attackers now have more interest because there are more systems, there are more users, there are more devices. So yeah, I'm not sure to summarize that in one sentence.
It's probably also hard to tell, right?
Yeah.
Also, a very interesting question, also from my perspective as a developer. Do you know of any sources or sites which you could recommend where you can really practice secure coding?
Good question. I don't know exactly. I've been following one very much security-oriented site called Peerlist with a Y. It's more for operations type security, but it would give some idea to a developer as well. Your question intrigued me, and I will look for some dedicated sources in that direction. It would be sad if there aren't any.
Yeah, cool. There's another question which is a little bit more complicated, so I try to raise it correctly. If not, please somebody correct me. Daniel is asking you that you mentioned that MD5 is a no-go for hashing passwords. And as far as he knows, there are only collision attacks known for MD5, which are a problem which is not specific to hashing passwords. So are there any concrete attacks known for MD5 hash passwords apart from the standard brute force or dictionary attacks?
Well, first, if it's not using salt, then obviously you can consider that brute force. There is also dumps everywhere of MD5 passwords. I don't think I know by heart that there's any such attack, but yeah, good question. The general rule, as he said, just avoid it. Whether it's really that bad to have MD5 hashed passwords, probably not the end of the world. The question is mostly right in saying that it might not affect passwords as much if everything else is correct, that is using the proper salt, etc. But as a general rule, stay away from MD5.
Okay. And we still have one question. I think that's probably the last one because our time is running out. Do you recommend any security measurements or tools for business smartphones running Android?
Well, first, don't root your Android, even if you are very interested in some apps that require routing. What I like most about newer versions of Android and iOS as well is that they have secure storage. That is, they allow you to store cryptographic keys in a way that they cannot be extracted with software means. So from a developer perspective, when doing stuff on Android, do try to make use of that if you have to do some cryptographic operations. And in many cases, you have to. As for stuff like antivirus or other things, I don't have an antivirus because I don't think there is any good one. The usual measures like do not install things from the untrusted sources, do not install apps that you don't really need for the business purpose of the phone, for example, some training apps or yoga apps or cooking apps or stuff like that, which can at least look initially look benign, but they may be hijacked in the end and become vulnerable. So apart from the general best practices like install the minimum and don't open random things.
Okay.
Yeah, there are these endpoint security solutions, I think from Zimperium and others that promise improved security for such devices. I haven't used them, so I can't recommend them, but it's worth checking them out.
Okay, cool. So our time is running out. Thank you pretty much for your talk and also for all the questions. Before all people leave, I will start a poll right now where you can say how nice you liked the talk or how much you liked it. And you can still discuss if you have any questions or you don't feel that the question will answered good enough for your taste. You can go to the Slack channel. Bozhidar is probably also coming to answer some questions afterwards. So, and with that, I wish you a nice big tech day for the last 4 hours. And thank you very much, Bozhidar, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.